The Victorian ideal, or perhaps fantasy of domesticity, was that the lady of the house should be, as Charles Dickens describes it in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, the ministering angel of domestic bliss. Victorian women were encouraged to make their home a reassuring sanctuary for their husbands, away from the jealousies, cares and dangers of working life.
The idea of the angel of the house was obviously a literary creation, but it tapped in completely to what the Victorians essentially wanted. It was a movement away from the fact that in the 18th century, usually father and mother had pitched in together in the business. With the professionalisation, the growth of factories, the home was away from the place of work, so the home became this ideal place of perfection and taste, this bubble, enclosed bubble of purity.
As the home became an ideal, it needed to be protected and nurtured, and therefore buying things for the home, creating things for the home, came to be seen as the woman's occupation.
The men went out there conquering the empire, the women stayed at home and kept things pure.
Women were expected not only to create the perfect home, the lady of the house had to measure up as well. Our next danger in this house is in the bedroom. The pursuit of this feminine ideal wasn't entirely safe. Lurking in many beautifying products were harmful toxins. Part of being the ideal Victorian woman was looking just right. Whatever your physique, one of these came in handy. In fact, this was essential.
Corsets kept everything under control, and they meant self-reserve, and that was vital to the Victorian woman, because the opposite was just excess and freedom and flesh flying everywhere, and once you did that, well, the world might fall down.
Feels quite tight already. You're actually just squeezing all the air out of my mouth. Sarah Nicol looks after one of the biggest corset collections in the country.
So Sarah, tell me about all the different layers we can see here. What's going on?
First of all, we've got the chemise underneath, so you would never have worn your corset next to your skin.
The corset predates the bra. Its function was to support the chest and help take the weight of up to 14 pounds of clothing.
But you could, on occasion, then over the top of this, you would have had a petticoat as well.
That's sort of 5 garments before
Yeah.
you've even got to your outerwear.
It is, yes. So this is part of the Symington.
The Symington factory manufactured corsets that were affordable for everybody.
They did all of their own artwork and printing for all their box tops for their corsets. It's just beautiful.
It may look beautiful, but women were unwittingly paying a terrible price. In the 1860s and 70s, corsetry became increasingly extreme.
By the mid-19th century, the ideal female form, the corseted female form, was everywhere in newspapers, magazines, journals aimed at women. And this celebrity, the actresses had it, the dancers had it, but particularly these fashion plates had it, this impossible figure. I mean, they were drawn simply because no woman would look like that.
What kind of corsets and how restrictive they were depended on your age, your class, your occupation, and how fashionable you were.
It was recommended that a corset was to be worn at all times, and there was no escape, not even in the colonies.
Symington's made this to market directly at ladies that were going to tropical regions. So they were either going with their man or to get their man. It's called the ventilated corset. For obvious reasons, it has the centre section removed.
There were women wearing this in all parts of the British Empire,
Yeah,
whatever the weather.
Yes, and you were regarded as a loose woman if you didn't wear your corset.
It demonstrated their character, and it demonstrated that they were fine and upright citizens and, you know, fit for the British Empire.
These robust cages of whalebone and steel were turned into potential killers by one surprisingly small technological advance: the metal eyelet.
What difference does that make?
It allows people, if they want to tight lace their corset without the fabric pulling away.
The metal eyelet made it easier to get the look because it was possible to lace tightly without the material tearing, as it previously would have done.
there was a fashion for wearing very, very, very tight bodices. I mean, it's fascinating. You see in photographs the fabric pulls in a way that we would think means it doesn't fit.
A tight lacing is something that a minority of people did, and that is to get your waist as small as you possibly can. They used to do this by lacing their corset tighter and tighter.
Some women would keep their corsets on day and night to train their bodies.
So what are the effects of a corset on the body in the long term?
Well, if I could just show you here the position of the normal organs. So the liver, for example, our largest internal organ, sits underneath the ribs on the right. And so it's a large wedge-shaped organ that sits here under the ribs. And so in a corset, which brings the ribs in very tightly to give the typical small-waisted outline, the liver gets squashed upwards and it presses against the ribs. And in fact, there are specimens of livers taken from women who have died who've worn tight corsets, actually have ridges on them where the ribs have made indentations in the surface of the liver because it's been so tight. And another organ that may be affected by a tight corset is the stomach. That sits here, underneath the rib cage, and so if the rib cage is pulled in by the corset, the stomach is pushed downwards into the abdominal cavity, and that would then have an effect on the rest of the abdominal organs, which would be pushed down.
This is a pregnancy corset from 1885.
Some women even wore corsets when pregnant.
A particular choice came for women about the corset is when they fell pregnant, because many husbands complained they didn't want their baby's head shaped and moulded, but there were women who continued to wear corsets through pregnancy, which, you know, there's no way at all that is possibly good for the baby.
One of the problems with corsets after pregnancy, particularly if women had a lot of babies, was that of prolapse of the uterus. The pelvic floor muscles having been weakened during childbirth, and then a very tight corset that increases the pressure in the abdomen, forcing all the organs down. So that would have been a very unwanted side effect of wearing tight corsets.
Now it's my turn.
I've got it a little bit tighter. I don't know whether you can feel that I've got it any tighter.
Yeah, I can feel it. Yeah.
I confess I felt delighted to have a smaller waist.
Oh, result! Yes. I can see why they did it now. 24 inches, look.
24 3/4.
The Victorian household guides even advised on suitable exercises for a lady.
I'm just exhausted after doing just that. I'm not really that unfit, honestly.
Or am I? We're going to use sports science equipment with Matt Ferber to measure the effect of the corset on my body.
Yep, I'm happy. You happy?
Yep.
Yeah, as happy as you can be.
First, I have to give him a baseline of fitness without the corset. I exercise for 6 minutes. Now Matt monitors my vital signs with the corset on. First, how it affects me at rest.
And 3, 2, 1, go.
And I repeat the same exercise with Matt measuring my heart rate and airflow.
How hard do you think you're working?
Feels like a 16 now.
16 good heart rate.
177.
175, lovely, good. 2 minutes to go.
Halfway through, and Matt's already seeing the changes.
And stop. Okay, if you just want to go and take a seat. Feel okay now? Feel lightheaded?
I'm a bit lightheaded.
Worse than last time?
Yeah.
I feel close to fainting, and it takes 2 minutes for my head to clear, and I'm not even tight-laced.
Breathing okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, last 10 seconds. Excellent. Well done. You're free.
So what happened?
Is that right? Let's get this off you as well.
What can science reveal about the effects of a corset?
So in terms of the rate in which you're breathing,
Look at that.
so even at rest you can see, so you got the red line is when you're wearing your corset and the blue line is not when you're not wearing your corset. So you see even at rest when you're sitting down, you're breathing in the corset of around about 23, 24 breaths per minute, whereas when you didn't have the corset on, you were down at about 14 breaths per minute. So it shows that even at rest, the corset is really restricting. And then when it actually comes to when you're doing the exercise, and you can see with your figures, with the corset on, your tidal volume, so the amount of air you're getting every breath, is a lot lower. So you're breathing approximately 200 to 300 mils less every single breath with the corset on.
Gosh.
Yeah.
So that's why at the end I felt like I was really fighting to get in air.
Absolutely. Really with these figures you can really see the impact the corset, the restriction the corset's having. You're basically hyperventilating in the corset. That's kind of what's happening, because you're breathing an awful lot faster, over 10 breaths per minute. It's an extra 25% faster wearing a corset.
I've proved it's damaging, but could it be a killer?
That chronic underperfusion, not getting enough air down into the bottom of the lungs, could cause problems. It predisposes to infections like pneumonia, and that was something that a very tight corset, worn for many hours a day, could cause problems with. If a woman had an underlying problem, it could exacerbate it. So, for example, if a young girl had rickets from vitamin D deficiency, she'd have soft bones that were still developing, and they could be distorted very much by wearing a tight corset. There are stories of the ribs breaking and piercing the lung underneath, which could be fatal.
As the century wore on, the corset became the focus of a huge debate.
Women's possibilities for activity became much larger over the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, there was nothing unvirtuous in going around on your bicycle, in walking freely. And so this really wasn't very practical for them to be wearing corsets. I mean, this simply didn't work. And increasingly, women began to say, these are pointless, they're just getting in the way. I'm spending hours in the morning getting myself into the corset when I could be doing something far more useful. It really also coincided with the growth of the votes for women, the idea that women were equal citizens. So if they're equal citizens demanding the vote, they shouldn't be treated as some kind of excessive ornament that are there to be looked at and there to be admired, and are ruining their health just so they look right for men.
The campaign for change was spearheaded by the Rational Dress Society, established in 1881. Constance Wilde, wife of Oscar, edited the Rational Dress Gazette.
The Rational Dress Society protests against the introduction of any fashion in dress that either deforms the figure, impedes the movement of the body, or in any way tends to injure health.
By the 1890s, some manufacturers had started to respond to demands for looser clothing. Yet one thing will probably never disappear: the temptation to conform to an ideal of beauty, whatever the cost.
Why did women carry on wearing corsets? Well, for exactly the same reason as I was delighted to have a 24-inch waist. It was psychologically rewarding, even if physically it could take its toll.
The idea of that S-shaped figure, we are completely enthralled to it even now. So I don't think that we can really look back on the Victorians and say, oh my goodness, weren't they silly, fainting when they sang, falling all over the place because they wore corsets. I don't think we can say we're that necessarily that far away.
The desire to look beautiful remains a constant through the ages, but what is considered attractive in each era differs.
The art of beauty, we always want to do the same things. And what distinguishes the Victorian period from the Edwardian period is that in the Victorian period, you were supposed to be perfectly beautiful with no assistance whatsoever. In the Edwardian period, you could use a little bit of help.
By now, makeup was being sold over the counter in the new department stores, and the products were advertised to Edwardian women by actresses famed for their beauty.
Actresses were seen as more acceptable by the Edwardians. One particularly famous actress, Lily Langtry, was actually noted very much for her beauty, and she really capitalised on this by lending her name to various beauty products, including face creams in this period.
Lily Langtry here, advertising Pear soap, and she was apparently paid £132, which was exactly what she weighed.
Lily Langtry's beauty was known to have caught the eye of the king, so it became a style to be copied. But beauty came at a cost. Makeup was not subject to any safety testing. Many new products made bogus claims, but were dangerous, and in extreme cases, a killer.
The death of a young girl who had managed to acquire perforation of the stomach through eating raw rice, with a view to improving her complexion.
The Edwardian woman was told to make herself beautiful, to catch her husband and to keep her husband. By doing so, she covered her face in poison.
The dangers began before any makeup had been applied, with face cream.
An Edwardian lady had to have a pure lily-white skin to distinguish herself from the sun-tanned working classes. And some of the most dangerous products are things like this. This is Harriet Hubbard Eyre moth and freckle lotion.
What is that?
Moths were sort of liver spots. It was a 19th century term for liver spots and discolorations on the skin. And a lot of them are well, pretty much camphor, bleach, ammonia, anything you could choose to sort of blanch your skin, because you had to have a pure lily-white skin. As late as sort of 1909, Vogue was advertising arsenic wafers, which you would take to get rid of, you know, any poor skin issues, and arsenic soap for that offending pimple.
On top of these layers of poison, they put a dusting of toxic powder.
Poisonous chemicals have very bright and distinctive colours, and so there were lead compounds, for example, that were very white, and so women liked to use it on their skin as part of a face powder, and that would be absorbed through the skin and could cause chronic lead poisoning.
Different things were used for rouge. Cochineal, which was made out of crushed insects, that's fine, but vermilion came from mercury.
Mercury is a heavy metal and it's very bad for the body. It can affect several different organs, particularly the brain, the lungs and the kidneys. It can cause problems with sensation, unable to feel things, maybe unable to see, and can cause you to go mad eventually.
Even the eyes weren't safe.
There was a product for darkening your eyelashes and your eyebrows, which actually made your cornea fall off, and several people went blind.
One of the things that women liked to use in the early 20th century was belladonna. This is obtained from a plant, and when drops are put in the eyes, it makes the pupils dilate, which is meant to signify desire and arousal, and so made women look more attractive. One of the problems with this, of course, is that it's a drug, and when it's absorbed, it can have an effect on the rest of the body. At best, it would probably have caused blurred vision and a dry mouth, and at worst, a very irregular heartbeat and even blindness.
You didn't know what was in these things. There's no description of content or anything like that, because there was no legal obligation to do so.
A lot of new treatments were encouraged at this time, all in the name of beauty. The crowning glory of an Edwardian woman was her hair, and to be truly fashionable it had to be curly, coiffed and big, a process that often destroyed what it was meant to enhance. These elaborate hairstyles took a lot of effort that inevitably led to unsafe practices with horrible consequences.
At the inquest, Dr. Chaldecott stated that the dry shampoo was exceedingly dangerous owing to the impracticability of keeping the fumes away from the customer.
There was a big problem in the Edwardian period of female baldness.
Why were women going bald?
People were using very dangerous hair dyes, which was one of the causes, but the other big cause, I mean, you'd have been fine with your fabulous curls, but everybody curled their hair. And so if you're doing that, so allow me to demonstrate, this would give you a sort of a crimp.
Yes.
For travelling, you might have a little one like that. So you were curling your hair the whole time, and the dangers of burning with this were absolutely extreme.
Tongs like these were heated in the fire and applied straight onto the hair, often burning it off. But worse was to follow.
Carl Nestler came up with the first permanent waving machine in 1906, but not before he'd burnt his wife's hair off twice.
Goodness me.
So definitely, there's a reason for baldness, if ever I saw one.
Messler's Wonder Machine involved wrapping the hair around rods and covering it with alkaline paste and, most dangerously of all, asbestos. Gas was then used to steam the curls tight. It would take 6 hours. It was extremely popular. Once your hair was right, you had the challenge of adding a hat, and so introduced another danger.
Look at that whacking grey hat. You couldn't put your hat on your head without huge hat pins. These were up to 14 inches long, and that was another very dangerous thing, because you've got all that incredibly sort of sharp pointed end. Ladies were banned from wearing unprotected hat pins on omnibuses in case they scratched people. Suffragettes had their hat pins removed when they went into court in case they stabbed people. And Edwardian novelists did do lovely little sort of vignettes of ladies preserving their virtue by stabbing an aggressor and a dirty old man with a hat pin.
Ironically, while she was killing herself to look beautiful, the Edwardian middle-class woman was herself a killer of wildlife.
The biggest killer in the Edwardian home was undoubtedly the Edwardian lady herself, with her taste for hats decorated with the most exotic feathers and sometimes even whole dead birds. Thousands of songbirds, egrets, birds of paradise slaughtered in the name of millinery.
A public outcry led to the end of the fashion for dead birds on hats and to the establishment of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Birds in 1904. Women, however, continued to be the willing victims of the beauty industry.
Bald, blind, burnt, scarred, Edwardian makeup was a dangerous business. In fact, the early 20th century was poised on the verge of the mass production of cosmetics and the explosion of a whole new industry.
One that would test their products first before releasing them on consumers. My final hidden killer can be found all over the house, but I'm going in search of the kitchen variety, into the heart of the woman's domain. We have seen how men and their power tools came a cropper. Now we see how the newly on-tap electricity brought considerable danger into the shiny world of appliances. The magazines are full of adverts showing women breezily vacuuming their houses in high heels. One article is even entitled, "Cinderella would have stayed at home if her fairy godmother had first conjured up all this kitchen equipment."
After the Second World War, the main technology that people have in their kitchens is the gas cooker. But we start to get the fridge, we get the vacuum cleaner coming in, also washing machines and also eventually freezers. And these technologies really do make quite a difference to women's everyday lives.
Electrical gadgets had previously been expensive luxuries. Now there was an explosion of new, affordable brands, all marketed as taking the drudgery out of housework.
This is an article by Jane Story titled "What Electric Living Means to Women." And she says, "For people like myself who have a full-time job, plus a home and family to look after, such labour-saving automatic service is a tremendous boon."
If you think about the domestic labour involved, for example, in the weekly washing day, if you've got, say, a family with a large number of children and you have to sort of wash all of their clothes and dry them by hand, you can imagine just how much difference something like a washing machine really would have made to women's lives.
So this booklet talks about what your Monday to Friday routine of cleaning should be.
Oh, gosh, that's quite a heavy workload.
So here we've got vacuum all carpets. A thorough once-a-week clean with your hoover will clear away any embedded grit.
Yes, but that's on Wednesdays after you've cleaned all the floors and polished where necessary. So actually, it is a 4-week schedule, isn't it? For the housewife who's also going out to work, of course.
Yes.
But these labour-saving devices, welcomed with open arms by the housewife, sometimes resulted in undesirable consequences. Unscrupulous manufacturers produced goods that were shoddily made, badly designed, even downright dangerous.
Things like kettles. Somebody came up with a wonderful idea of making a kettle. You plug the lead in, when it got to a certain temperature, it spat the electric lead out. Now, I don't think you need to be a scientist to work this out. There's not that many kettle points in the kitchen. There's obviously one straight right by the side of the sink. You're doing your dishes, your kettle's plugged in, it shoots the power supply straight out, lands in the sink.
People often didn't really understand electricity or their appliances, which led to some horrendous accidents. The Courier newspaper in Dundee consulted a local electrician as to the safest way of handling appliances. He told them,
electrical appliances used in the home nowadays are safe, if respected and treated with care. The danger of ignorance of these appliances or wear and tear on them has been emphasized recently by a number of burning accidents.
Another solution came from the Electrical Association for Women, who urged that girls should be educated.
For heaven's sake, teach them how to look after the beautiful electrical apparatus they are now getting, so that girls who will be future housewives will at least know the rudiments of how to look after the apparatus.
Education would surely help, but some products were overused and poorly maintained.
They would have dodgy connections, they might spark a bit when you use them. But, it'll be all right, I'll get one next week or when payday comes. But obviously you really did need to keep them maintained and changed and make sure that you only buy them from a proper electrical retailer.
There could be a high price to pay if you didn't.
Mrs. Montgomery died from an electric shock sustained when using an electric iron. Mr. Montgomery stated that his wife had told him about the electric iron failing and breaking. She had tied the handle with string. It is a deplorable instance of the dangers of using electric equipment which is not in proper order, commented Sheriff Hamilton.
The Electrical Trades Union reported that
some of these accidents could have been prevented had there been some control over the manufacture of appliances and enforcement of the regulations.
In October 1954, in a debate in the House of Lords on safety in the home, Lord Crook complained of the constant sale of very cheap electrical goods, the use of which is not always understood by the purchaser. Lord Mancroft, though, felt the government had done what it could, and that the final responsibility rests with the individual, the person in the home. Consumers, though, had had enough. They decided that they needed more information in order to look after their own interests. Which magazine was set up in 1957 to provide an independent review of products for consumers. By the time this one was published in 1959, the Consumers Association which produced it had 150,000 members. And this represents a sense that nowadays it wasn't enough to trust manufacturers' claims. Not everything could be taken at face value, and consumers needed someone on their side. Consumer power had its roots in the post-war era and continues today.